Welcome back to Ancient Echoes, where history sharpens its spear and the past doesn't just whisper, it marches. I'm Chelsea, and in this episode, we turn our eyes from emperors and institutions to something a bit more dramatic: battles. Not just the bloodshed, but the turning points, the moments when Rome wasn't just tested by swords and strategy, but by its own ambition. Because Rome didn't conquer the world with marble and rhetoric alone. It conquered it with boots, discipline, engineering, and very efficient violence. And if you've ever underestimated a people who invented aqueducts and crucifixion in the same century, you haven't met the Romans. This episode isn't just about every Roman battle, because we'd be here for days and still not get past Julius Caesar's weekend itinerary. Instead, we'll focus on the defining military moments that shaped the Republic's rise, the empire's expansion, and its eventual unraveling. From the gritty backroads of Samnium to the frozen Alps, from Hannibal's elephants to Caesar's ambitions, and from imperial glory to imperial overstretch. We'll talk about the lessons Rome learned the hard way, the enemies who forced it to evolve, and the victories that looked a little too much like future regrets. So grab your gladius, or at least your mental map of the Mediterranean, and join me as we trace the pulse of power through the wars that forged, scarred, and ultimately strained the Roman world. First up, Rome's early brawls with the Samnites and the Greeks, because nothing builds an empire quite like learning to lose convincingly before you start winning relentlessly. Before Rome faced Carthage, or it tangled with barbarian hordes or dreamed of empires stretching from Britain to Babylon, it had to learn how to survive its neighbors. Because the early republic was less a majestic rising eagle and more of a scrappy city-state in a toga, throwing punches at anything that moved. And no one punched back harder than the Samnites. From 343 to 290 BC, Rome fought a series of wars with the Samnites, a tribal confederation living in the mountains of central Italy, rough terrain, and tougher people. The Samnites didn't fight like the Greeks. They didn't build cities like the Etruscans. They fought guerrilla style, ambushing Roman troops in narrow passes and mountain trails. The low point? The Battle of Caudine Forks in 321 BC. The Romans marched into a trap, were surrounded in a mountain pass, and were forced to surrender without a fight. And then they were made to pass under a yoke, a humiliating ritual where Roman soldiers walked beneath spears held overhead by their enemies. It was like a public shaming mixed with a bad team-building exercise. To be clear, this was not the triumphant Roman energy you see on coins. But here's the thing about Rome. It learned. Painfully, slowly, but thoroughly. After decades of defeat, regrouping, and good old-fashioned stubbornness, Rome crushed the Samnites and absorbed them into their expanding network of alliances. And what did Rome do with those hard-earned lessons? It took them south, towards the Greeks. In the early 3rd century BC, the city of Tarentum, a Greek colony in southern Italy, found itself facing Roman pressure, so they called in help from across the Adriatic. Enter Pyrrhus, king of Epirus, cousin of Alexander the Great, veteran of many battles, and proud owner of war elephants, which no Roman had ever seen before. In 280 BC, at the Battle of Heraclea, Pyrrhus defeated the Romans, barely. A year later, at Asculum, he won again. Again, barely. Legend has it that after the battle, Pyrrhus muttered something like, "Another such victory, and I am undone." And thus we get the term Pyrrhic victory, a win so costly it feels like a loss with extra paperwork. Despite his flashy tactics and royal decree, Pyrrhus couldn't match Rome's greatest strength: resilience. The Romans just kept showing up, losing, rebuilding, and then showing up again. Eventually, Pyrrhus left Italy, and Rome took control of the south. So, what did Rome learn? These early conflicts were Rome's apprenticeship. The Samnites taught them to fight dirty. Pyrrhus taught them to think bigger. And in every clash, Rome refined three key advantages. Military adaptability. Rome borrowed tactics from everyone they fought. The citizen soldier model. Their armies were made up of landowners with skin in the game. Political absorption. Rome didn't just conquer, it offered allies a share in the system, eventually. And above all, Rome learned this. You don't need to win every battle. You just need to outlast everyone else. Which is also a solid life strategy, unless you're dealing with toddlers like I am. So by the early 3rd century BC, Rome was no longer just one of many Italian powers. It was the power, and the world was about to notice. Next, we'll travel to the Western Mediterranean, where Rome meets its most formidable rival yet, Carthage, and a general named Hannibal, who thought crossing the Alps with elephants sounded like a good idea. By the 3rd century BC, Rome had conquered Italy, but ambition, like empire, has no off switch. To the south, across the Mediterranean, stood Carthage, a wealthy seafaring empire built on trade, strategy, and a very firm belief that elephants make everything more impressive. The result was the Punic Wars, a series of 3 wars that spanned over a century and tested Rome in ways no mountain tribe or overconfident Greek prince ever had. If the Samnites were Rome's sparring partners, Carthage was its heavyweight rival, and Hannibal, he was the uppercut they didn't see coming. The First Punic Wars, between 264 and 241 BC, started as most ancient wars did, over Sicily, a place everyone wanted, no one owned, and both sides claimed with increasing levels of pettiness. Rome, being a land power, didn't have a navy, so they built one, from scratch. Legend said they copied a Carthaginian ship that washed ashore, and in true Roman fashion, they added a giant boarding plank, because why learn to sail when you can just turn naval battles into land battles? Rome won by sheer determination and the invention of the corvus, a gangplank with a spike that allowed Roman soldiers to board enemy ships and fight on deck where they were more comfortable. It was less naval warfare, more high-stakes floating bridge club. By 241 BC, Carthage surrendered Sicily, and the Romans got a taste for overseas conquest. Then came Hannibal Barca, tactician, master of logistics, personal nemesis to the Roman psyche for centuries. In 218 BC, Hannibal famously led an army, including dozens of war elephants, across the Alps in winter to invade Italy from the north. Let me repeat, elephants through the Alps. This is the ancient world's equivalent of showing up to a chess match riding a rhinoceros. His campaign in Italy was nothing short of devastating. At Caen in 216 BC, Hannibal's smaller force encircled and annihilated a Roman army of nearly 80,000, one of the worst defeats in Roman history. The Romans lost whole legions. Panic gripped the Republic. But once again, Rome didn't give up. It adapted. Enter Fabius Maximus, nicknamed the Delayer, who avoided open battle and slowly wore Hannibal down through a war of attrition. Basically, Rome realized it couldn't out-Hannibal, so it outlasted him instead, like a very annoyed but immovable wall. Finally, the Roman general Scipio Africanus took the fight to Carthage's homeland. In 202 BC, at the Battle of Zama, Scipio defeated Hannibal decisively. Carthage lost its empire, Rome gained Spain, and Hannibal, he lived out his days in exile, reportedly drinking poison to avoid capture. A tragic end for one of history's greatest military minds. The Third Punic War, 149 to 146 BC, wasn't really a war, it was more a statement. Carthage, weakened and no longer a threat, was still breathing, and that made Rome uncomfortable. Enter Cato the Elder, who ended every Senate speech, no matter the topic, with Carthago delenda est, which means Carthage must be destroyed. Picture someone yelling, unsubscribe at the end of every meeting until it finally happens. Rome attacked, besieged Carthage, and ultimately destroyed it. Brick by brick, they burned the city, killed or enslaved its inhabitants, and according to later legend, they even salted the earth, just in case history wasn't dramatic enough on its own. What did Rome learn? From Carthage, Rome learned not just how to fight, but how to justify empire. Wars became preemptive, enemies became warnings, and victory became a moral imperative. The Punic Wars transformed Rome from a regional power into a Mediterranean empire, and set the precedent for what it meant to rule not just with strength, but with fear. Because once you've torched a rival city for existing a little too confidently, subtlety goes out the window. Rome had survived Hannibal, defeated Carthage, claimed Spain, but its appetite only grew. Next, we'll follow Rome's march eastward, where Greek kingdoms fell, the Old World collapsed, and the empire's ambitions reached new heights. With Carthage smoldering and Spain tucked securely under its belt, Rome turned its attention east, towards the remnants of Alexander the Great's empire. You know, the Hellenistic kingdoms, big on ideas, architecture, philosophy, and terminally bad at succession planning. What Rome found was it wasn't a unified enemy, it was a shattered Greek world full of wealthy cities, squabbling dynasties, and just enough political drama to make a reality show jealous. If Carthage was a worthy rival, the Hellenistic East was an inheritance waiting to be seized. Between 214 and 148 BC, Rome fought a series of wars against Macedon, the most prominent Greek power of the time. Their opponent was King Pyrrhus of Macedon, who, spoiler alert, was no Alexander. The final showdown came in 168 BC at the Battle of Pydna. Now, this was more than just another Roman victory. It was the moment the Greek phalanx and the Roman legion. The phalanx warfare was elegant in its design and was based on cohesion. Long spears, tight formations, a wall of bronze. But on an uneven terrain, it broke like fine china. The Roman legion, with its smaller units and tactile flexibility, danced circles around it, literally. Think of it as the academic debate equivalent of someone bringing note cards to a sword fight. Pyrrhus was defeated, Macedon was absorbed, and Rome quietly reminded the world that it could now defeat the intellectual descendants of Plato and the military descendants of Alexander. While Rome was busy lecturing the Greeks with spears, things were also heating up in the West. In 121 BC, Rome defeated a Gallic confederation in southern France, adding Transalpine Gaul to its holdings. This was significant not just territorially, but symbolically. Rome was now fully committed to being an empire of multiple frontiers, not just east and west, but north as well. And there was another bonus: gold mines. Because if there's one thing that helps fund future conquests, it's a lot of shiny reasons to keep expanding. Gaul would become even more important later, particularly for one ambitious general named Julius Caesar. But at this point, Rome was simply laying the groundwork. So what was changing? By the mid-2nd century BC, Rome had become the thing it used to fear, a superpower with standing armies abroad, colonies to manage, and a rapidly expanding underclass of conquered people. And with every new territory came tribute, resources, political complications, and generals whose personal glory often outshined the Senate that sent them. Rome was still a republic, but let's just say it was a republic in the way that your group chat is collaborative, technically. Yes, but we all know who's actually calling the shots. Rome's expansion was brilliant, strategic, and profitable. It was also becoming harder to manage. So by 100 BC, Rome was no longer a regional power. It was a Mediterranean giant, juggling wars, provinces, foreign kings, and its own increasingly wobbly sense of balance. And soon, the enemy wouldn't come from beyond its borders. He would come from within. Up next, civil wars, assassinations, and a naval battle that decided the fate of the Republic itself. For all its military brilliance, Rome's greatest struggle wasn't with Carthage or Greece. It was with itself. Because when you build a system on ambition, glory, and personal achievement, you eventually run into a problem. Everyone wants to be the exception to the rules they swore to protect. And so, by the 1st century BC, Rome stopped fighting foreign wars and started fighting civil ones, with alarming frequency and increasing theatrical flair. It started quietly enough. In the 130s BC, Tiberius Gracchus, a tribune of the people, proposed land reforms to help Rome's struggling poor. The Senate responded by beating him to death in a riot. Rome had officially entered the murder your political opponents phase of the Republic's decline, which, historically speaking, is not a great sign. Over the next few decades, powerful generals like Marius, Sulla, and Pompey would amass personal armies, march on Rome, and rewrite the rules as they went. And then came Julius Caesar, whose conquest of Gaul and crossing of the Rubicon, famously without Senate permission, led to a civil war and the end of the Republic's pretense, and his eventual assassination in 44 BC. But if the conspirators thought killing Caesar would restore the Republic, they misread the room. It's in their defense, it's easy to misread a room full of senators when half of them are holding knives. After Caesar's death, 2 men emerged as his political heirs: Mark Antony, his loyal lieutenant, and Octavian, Caesar's adopted son and political wildcard. He was only 18 years old, sickly, and underestimated by absolutely everyone. They formed an uneasy alliance, hunted down Caesar's assassins, and then predictably turned on each other. Antony allied himself with Cleopatra VII, Queen of Egypt, which was equal parts romantic and strategic. Together, they presented themselves as the new power couple of the Eastern Mediterranean, divine rulers of land, sea, and spectacle. Rome, they weren't amused. The optics of a Roman general wearing eyeliner and calling himself New Dionysus didn't exactly play well in the Senate. In 31 BC, the two sides met at the Battle of Actium, a massive naval clash off of the coast of Greece. Octavian's fleet, commanded by Agrippa, outmaneuvered Antony and Cleopatra, forcing them to flee. It wasn't the most brutal battle, but it was the most decisive. With Antony discredited and his fleet in ruins, Octavian seized power. A year later, Antony and Cleopatra were dead by their own hands, in true tragic fashion. Fun fact, Cleopatra's death by asp is historically debated, but it remains excellent branding either way. With his rivals gone, Octavian became Augustus, Rome's first emperor. He maintained the illusion of republican governance, but the Senate was now ornamental, the elections theatrical, and the real power flowed through one man. The Republic, after centuries of resistance to monarchy, had become a monarchy in everything but name. It didn't fall in a day. It fell in speeches and battles and power grabs dressed up as public service. In short, it fell like most institutions do, slowly, then all at once. So ended the Republic, not with a collapse, but with a consolidation, not by invasion, but by ambition fulfilling its final form. But the story of Rome doesn't end with Augustus. Lastly, we follow the empire through its victories, its burdens, and its long descent, or external enemies weren't the cause of the fall, just the last chapter of a much older story. Rome didn't fall with a single sword thrust or a final dramatic siege. No flaming city, no final speech, no last emperor defiantly shouting into the wind. No, Rome fell the same way most great systems do, in pieces over centuries while still insisting everything was fine. Imagine someone rearranging deck chairs while saying, "Actually, we're stronger than ever," as the ship slides into the sea. By the 3rd century AD, Rome was overextended, underfunded, and politically unstable. It had too many frontiers, too many enemies, and most of all, too many emperors. Between 235 and 284 AD, the empire cycled through over 24 emperors, many of whom ruled for just a year or two before being assassinated, overthrown, or removed with extreme prejudice. The job security of a Roman emperor in this period made adjunct teaching look like a 10-year dream. Rome faced invasions from Germanic tribes, economic collapse and hyperinflation, plagues that killed tens of thousands, and a population increasingly disconnected from civic life. It was a perfect storm of dysfunction, and Rome responded the way it always had. It reorganized. Enter Diocletian, one of the few emperors who managed to both fix things and die in retirement, a rare combination in Roman leadership. Diocletian established the Tetrarchy, ruled by 4 emperors, each governing a section of the empire, east and west, senior and junior partners, a kind of imperial group project, with slightly more beheadings. He also instituted economic reforms, locked professions into family lines, and conducted the largest persecution of Christians in Roman history. He meant well, mostly, but when your legacy is the best crisis manager of a dying system, it's not exactly a flattering epitaph. After Diocletian became Constantine the Great, who is best known for 2 things: legalizing Christianity with the Edict of Milan and moving the imperial capital to Byzantium, which he renamed Constantinople. This marked a turning point, not just geographically, but ideologically. Rome, once the land of Jupiter and Mars, was now aligning itself with a monotheistic faith that preached humility, salvation, and a kingdom not of this world. The Christian church would survive the empire and in many ways replace it, as if Rome realized late in the game that spiritual authority had longer legs than military conquest. Meanwhile, on the frontiers, pressure was building. Germanic tribes, the Visigoths, Vandals, and the Ostrogoths, pushed closer and closer, both attacking and increasingly being recruited into the Roman military. In 378 AD, at the Battle of Adrianople, the Eastern Roman army was crushed by the Visigoths. The emperor, Valens, was killed in battle, and a logistical and symbolic disaster. Then in 410 AD, something unthinkable happened. Rome was sacked. The Visigoths, led by Alaric, breached the city defenses and looted it. For centuries, Rome had been untouchable, an icon of invincibility, and now it had been violated. And it wouldn't be the last time. By the mid-5th century, the Western Roman Empire was a shadow. The eastern half, based in Constantinople, remained strong and would survive for nearly 1,000 more years. But in the west, it ended quietly. In 476 AD, the barbarian general Odoacer deposed the teenage emperor Romulus Augustulus, a boy with a name that read like a fading memory of past greatness. No great battle happened, no last stand, just a handoff. And with that, the Western Roman Empire ceased to exist. So what caused the fall? Barbarians? Yes, but also internal rot, economic strain, political incompetence, and an empire built on expansion that forgot how to maintain what it conquered. Rome didn't fall from weakness, it fell from accumulated strength, stretched too thin, and wielded without restraint. In the end, it wasn't the sword that broke Rome, it was the weight of its own success. As we wrap it all up, we'll step back and consider what Rome's long, uneven fall still has to teach us today about power, resilience, and the fine line between glory and collapse. Rome won a lot of wars. That in itself is not remarkable. Many empires do. What's remarkable is what those victories cost and how often they became the beginning of the next crisis. Because Rome didn't just conquer enemies, it absorbed them. It made former rivals into allies, soldiers, citizens, and eventually emperors. It expanded until its borders touched deserts, forests, oceans, and its administration struggled to keep pace. And somewhere between brilliant adaptation and brutal overreach, the empire lost the thing it was fighting to protect: stability. Rome teaches us that military genius doesn't guarantee political wisdom, that every expansion opens new vulnerabilities, and that empires often fall not when they are weakest, but when they believe they are untouchable. Because history isn't written by the victors, it's written after the victors have run out of money, patience, and people willing to keep rebuilding the aqueducts. Thanks for marching through Rome's turning points with me on this episode of Ancient Echoes. If you enjoyed this episode, consider sharing it with a friend who loves history, and be sure to subscribe and leave us a review. In our next episode, we'll explore Roman art and literature, the cultural legacies that outlived the legions. Until then, may your strategies be sound, your battles well chosen, and your victories never more costly than their worth.